After Final Fantasy VII took the world by storm in the 1990s, Squaresoft decided to give some of its developers more creative control over future Squaresoft projects than they ever had before. One such example was Tetsuya Takahashi, whose grand and ambitious Xenogears project was unleashed upon the world and made quite a big impression on many RPG enthusiasts, myself included. But another instance of this happening was Yasumi Matsuno, who not only was given complete creative control over Final Fantasy Tactics, he was also given the license to personally direct and steer the creation of Vagrant Story, perhaps the most innovative Squaresoft title on the PlayStation. And many people fondly remember Vagrant Story. In fact, it kind of flies under the radar, constantly overshadowed by its giant brothers in the Final Fantasy series. So I thought it was time in this video to take a look back at Vagrant Story, what it represented, what made the game so unique, and let you know really is it worth playing today. But before I do that, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment down below with your favorite memories of Vagrant Story. When you first sit down and play Vagrant Story, I think the thing that jumps right out at you from the get-go is the unique graphical presentation. Because this game plays like no other game I've played before in terms of the visual approach. It's more like a movie than a game. You have all these carefully designed cutscenes between characters, with different camera angles and different character expressions. And in conjunction with that, you have actions that take place that change those expressions and change those dynamics. You really get the full encompassing experience out of this one like you would by watching a movie, and you just strongly get a sense playing it that whoever designed this game had a very strong sense of the importance of cinematography. And indeed, the game's creator Yasumi Matsuno said as much. He grew up being inspired by many movies, and he decided to incorporate it into his game. And he did so unconsciously. In fact, this is what he said in a 1999 developer interview for the game. In my case, it's not so much that I'm conscious of movies when I create, it's more that as a result of having grown up with them, everything I make ends up feeling somewhat like a movie. It's all stuff I absorbed unconsciously, a sense of what's cool, beautiful framing, stylish lighting, and it's all influenced me in one way or another. A single work becomes invested with many unconscious strands. And Matsuno's quote rings so true because it's impossible to play Vagrant Story without noticing all these influences along the way. It's truly in the first few minutes of Vagrant Story that you really get a sense of Matsuno's unique talent for storytelling. And right from the start, the player is swept up in a tale of betrayal, identity, and redemption. This one's set in the kingdom of Valendia in the ruined city of Leamonde. The story follows Ashley Riot, an elite agent known as a Riskbreaker, who's dispatched by the Valendia Knights of the Peace. He's assigned the task of investigating a connection between a charismatic cult leader named Sidney Losterot and a powerful parliament member named Duke Bardorba. The game actually begins with a prologue where Ashley is framed for the Duke's murder, and the narrative unfolds as a flashback, detailing the events of the week leading up to this. So as Ashley investigates the dark, mystical depths of Leamonde, he uncovers a web of political intrigues, supernatural forces, and even personal revelations about his own past, which he's completely haunted by. Both the game's narrative and its dialogue is presented in a unique font, and I dare say it makes it look like a comic book. In fact, the whole game is presented in some ways like a comic would be, a dark comic at that. The entire English localization really seems a cut above other games on the PlayStation as well, and again, this is something that's immediately noticeable. It's a polished translation that doesn't suffer from many of the grammatical errors or weird word choices of the time. But beyond being relatively free from errors, it also has its own unique flair verbally too. And according to Chief Localizer Alexander O. Smith, he was given instruction to use biblical style language and Shakespearean language to really make it stand out in a unique way compared to all of its rivals at that time. And it truly does. You can see this from the dialogue from the beginning of the game to the end of it. Another interesting facet of Vagrant Story, at least to me, is that its setting of Leamonde is actually influenced by cities in the real world. In fact, so much so that Matsuno brought his design team to the city of Saint-Emilion, France, to actually take in the scenery and incorporate it into areas in the game. And this is done incredibly effectively. It stands out compared to kind of the European style and medieval style castles that you find in other RPGs. But it wasn't just the unique graphical presentation and the storytelling that stood out and drew players in about Vagrant's story. It was also the gameplay, and that was extremely innovative as well. Some might call it cumbersome though. This was because the game featured a pretty complex battle system that blended real-time and turn-based mechanics. It really emphasized strategy, timing, consideration, customization, and adjusting on the fly. So essentially, when you're wandering around the world and encounter an enemy, you enter into a battle mode of sorts that shows a wireframe sphere around Ashley. And from there you can see which of the individual enemies' body parts are targetable. Most enemies have multiple of these, and they each sometimes have different weaknesses. In fact, if you use the Analyze skill, you can generally see what an enemy's weakness is, and they might be weak to certain types of weapons. There's 3 weapon types in this game. There's blunt, there's piercing, and then there's edged. And if you don't make the right choices in this regard, it can lead to incredible frustration. You can do almost 0 damage if you don't target an enemy's weakness well, or target the right body part well, or use the right abilities. And that's been at the crux of some players' problems with this game, is that it's potentially too convoluted to some. If you're really into preparing for enemies and especially switching things up on the fly, even from enemy to enemy, you'll really love this game. But all this stuff takes a huge amount of menu manipulation. You had to analyze the weakness, switch around your weapons, change your equipment up, and really address each fight as its own individual encounter. This is not the kind of game where you're just running up and button mashing. Now, it is something of an adventure RPG hybrid, but Secret of Mana it is not. So if that's what you expected, you might be disappointed by this combat mode. Now, there are other interesting elements of combat though, like chain abilities. So players can actually chain attacks that are timed by pressing buttons in time with on-screen prompts. There's essentially kind of an explanation point that occurs while combat is taking place, and the player can kind of develop a rhythm. With each attack having distinct pacing, you can string together long chains and subsequently do more damage. In a way, it's kind of like Super Mario RPG, but to a whole new level. The same thing goes for defensive abilities, where you can use timed attacks to deflect, avoid, or reduce damage that happens to you too. Now, this is used in conjunction though with a risk meter, so the more attacks you chain together, the more damage you do, but at the cost of accuracy and enemies dealing more damage. So managing your risk is critically essential, because if you allow it to get to excessive levels, it can make combat nearly impossible. It's basically a recipe for game over. But there's also cool things too, like break arts. These are powerful special attacks that actually consume Ashley's hit points to do more damage, and these are very powerful and can often hit the enemy at a distance and doesn't accumulate risk. So this is one of the best ways to deal damage without having to pay attention to that risk management. There are magic effects too. These are learned from grimoires that are used, and once you use them, you have them permanently. And the ones that seem to be the most effective are the buffs and debuffs. Enemies get these too, so you have to pay attention to that. But buffing and debuffing is very important in this game. There is a weapon creation system too, where you can build weapons out of materials that you find throughout the world, and even combine 2 weapons together to build super powerful weapons. But that gets kind of convoluted too. Virtually all the gameplay requires a lot of micromanagement, and that can be a pretty big deal breaker to a lot of players, especially if they're comparing it to, again, the games that you run up and just slash away at enemies. This game is not that. It's also worth noting that the dungeons do contain puzzles as well, and most of these consist of moving around blocks, using levers, and constructing towers to circumvent and jump over things. There is some platforming in this way. You have to jump over pits, and it was pretty fun. I think the puzzle element worked pretty well, and they do gradually ramp up the difficulty of these puzzles as the game goes forward. Now for the soundtrack, Matsuno turned to Hitoshi Sakimoto like he essentially always did. Sakimoto was responsible for creating the soundtracks to Ogre Battle and Final Fantasy Tactics and often worked with Matsuno. But in this one, Sakimoto departed to some extent from what he had done in the past, because instead of using the melody-driven songs that he used in those games, this one is more of a dark and ambient feeling game, again matching with the cinematic approach that the storytelling narrative went with. From the records of the game's development, that was an intentional decision too, because Matsuno directed Sakimoto to basically forget Final Fantasy Tactics. So you might like this approach more, it's not my personal favorite, but I do agree that it aligns well with the game's atmosphere. Whatever can be said about Vagrant's story, no one can assert with confidence and honesty that it didn't set itself apart from virtually every game that existed back then, including other games in the Squaresoft library. This was a totally unique experience that tried new things and new innovations. And in a way, I would say it's one of Squaresoft's most ambitious games ever. The only game that rivaled it in that category I think is Xenogears, which was equally ambitious but for different reasons. This tried more creative things than Xenogears, but Xenogears had a far more complex and ambitious story. Nevertheless, the storyline, the characters, and the narrative is the best part of Vagrant's story. There's some serious themes visited here, and it really comes out in the way the game progresses. I had total enjoyment in watching these characters develop over time. I don't think all the gameplay concepts work too well. It's a brilliant game if you love simulation things and micromanagement, but that really isn't me. It's still fun, but it's really hard. It's rewarding, but it's challenging. And it's true, it can be a frustration magnet for many different types of players, but that doesn't take away or detract from the incredible visual appeal that the game has. Some people have said that this is the most beautiful looking PlayStation game and looks far beyond its time, and it's hard to disagree with that. They were really working with a lot of limitations here, and they really pushed the PlayStation to its graphical limits with this game. True, the polygons don't look as great as they would in future games, but man, for the PlayStation, this looks incredible. The colors and details, and even the stylistic elements in the game are really distinct. The character animations and even the expressions in their faces was far beyond everything that existed at that time. And you can see how it influenced other games that Matsuno worked on in the future, like Final Fantasy XII. So is it Squaresoft's best game ever? No, it's not to me, not by a long stretch actually. But if that was your opinion, in some ways I really couldn't blame you, especially if you thought that about the narrative, the story, and the cinematography, all of which are A+ in this game. It's definitely worth playing, and it's a crime that it went so overlooked and overshadowed. It came out toward the end of the PlayStation library, and I'd say this one is due for a remaster. So Square Enix, if you're looking through your games and trying to determine which ones to remaster next, this one should be near the top of that list. But I want to hear from you guys down below in the comments. If you played Vagrant Story or remember this game, leave me a comment letting me know what your favorite part of it was and what is so memorable about it to you. Please consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron for special bonuses, including advanced viewing of my videos. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.